Good morning. Well, no, sorry. Good afternoon, Daniel.
Good afternoon, Dan. Welcome back.
I think that's been my line for the last couple episodes with you.
It has, but I can't be the only one to take fun trips around here.
I suppose that's true. So, what are we talking about today?
Well, you had an exciting week. You've been traveling, going to the FPA retreat, and I wanted to know what you learned.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, what did I learn? Geez. I guess first for anybody's context listening, FPA is the Financial Planning Association, and succinctly, the retreat is sort of the cutting edge conference for financial planners. Like it's all the most veteran, most serious, most well known planners getting together to share knowledge and ideate. I'd say it's both really great research and practice and so on, but it's also just a peer network of some of the best planners in the world.
Okay, and where was it this year?
It was in ostensibly Chicago, Illinois. It was more out in like the suburbs, out at a place in Oak Brook, which was perfectly nice and whatnot, but not like Chicago with the skyscrapers and the gargoyles and the architecture. Not that version of Chicago.
And are these presentations, seminars, or just meeting with other like minded professionals?
It's a rotation, so you have essentially, call it 150, 200 people getting together. Many of them will present. Many of them have presented in the past, but you have like these formal education tracks throughout the day where you go to two, three, four sessions, and these are like formal presentations with PowerPoints or that sort of thing, and maybe one keynote a day. But then you also have these dedicated blocks to things called like under the trees, where you'll have a prompt like, "What does the financial planning profession look like in 20 years?" And people who are interested in talking about that will like go have lunch together and discuss that at lunch, or go have that as like a breakout session on its own to go discuss like the best uses of AI and financial planning or something like that.
All right, well, I'd love to hear what you learned, whether from some of those intimate breakout sessions or from some of the more formal presentations. Are there any things that stick out to you or highlights from the retreat?
Yeah, I mean oh God, highlights in the tree. It's literally that thing about like if you highlight every word on the page, it's not actually highlighted because everything at retreat is just top notch. It's a really high caliber event. So I think probably the first thing that stands out was the opening keynote, which was from the author Colin Woodard. He did a book called essentially American Nations and has done several other books, but essentially he's done a lot of historical, like sociographic work around like where American culture has grown out of, and like how it's grown and developed and changed, and like what the history and roots of that are, and tracking that over the centuries from like the founding all the way to the present, and why culture in different parts of the country is so different and so on.
All right, and respectfully, how does that apply to our profession and financial planning?
Well, so we all have cultural mores. So, we believe certain things, we have certain values, and we tend to share these things in common with our community, largely speaking. Like, you can still have Democrats and Republicans or different religions, that sort of thing. But, like when we think of something like the South is a place that we can distinctly think of as having particular values, particular history, like certain cultural expectations. Like you would not, for example, want to be super duper flamboyantly gay in like the deep South. Like we all sort of implicitly know culturally that that's maybe a bad idea. And in the same way, you would not want to walk around San Francisco with like a MAGA red Trump hat. Like you are gonna get stuff thrown at you, and just recognizing that like there are different cultures in different places, and from a planning application standpoint, that really the big key thing for that is recognizing that depending on where you are, depending on where your clients are, where you were raised, where they were raised, where you have lived, where they have lived, you likely have certain what you think of as like default assumptions and beliefs about society, about politics, morality, ethics, even money, that influence how you talk about those things or talk about things that are tangential from those things. And I mean, this can even affect something like your financial advice. Like different parts of the country show substantially statistically different things like average FICO scores, life expectancy, rate of charitable giving. So there's a lot of differences based on like not just purely geography, but sort of like where you live and what kind of dominant culture helped establish that area in history that then plays through to today.
That's really interesting. Even thinking personally, it's been about a year since I've been living here in Colorado. And I was getting my hair cut the other day and speaking to my barber about the differences. And one of the differences just between people is in Colorado, it's not uncommon to walk past somebody on the street and for one of the two people or both to say hello and engage in some sort of conversation, which is not really a thing in New York, New Jersey, where I'm originally from. Uh, and that's not a financial planning thing per se, but it does, tie into just getting involved in the community and starting to feel more comfortable having, those kinds of conversations with people here than I might have been reaching out to strangers back in New Jersey, which I find pretty true.
Well, and here's an interesting thing. So, like New Jersey, New York City, that whole area that you're from was originally settled by the Dutch, and so and it really didn't get much further than that. It's really just kind of like the Dutch little like splot on the map. And obviously, New York City and New Jersey and the whole metro area there is very diverse today, very different now. But that's just sort of the cultural background there. Here in Colorado, which the Mr. Woodard defines as just sort of the far west, which is kind of everything from like the middle of Nebraska and Kansas, north of Texas and Oklahoma, to essentially halfway across like Oregon, Washington, and California. And then you've got kind of a different cultural territory along the actual West Coast. But the far West was settled essentially by more companies than cultures. Like it was sort of this difficult to reach, arid, hard to inhabit area. And so it wasn't so much of just like natural migration, like, oh, I'll build my farm up the valley from my parents sort of stuff that happened in other parts of the United States. It was originally companies coming in and saying, like, there's gold in them, our hills, and we are going to go get it. And then recruiting and attracting people from all these various areas to come move to Colorado to work in these places for capitalistic personal advancement wealth reasons. All of that to say, I'm not actually sure why in Colorado, from that sort of historical background standpoint, there's so much just kind of like passive friendliness, saying hello to everybody you see or that sort of thing. But in certain regions, as you may be tacitly pointing out, right, like saying hello might get your ass kicked, and in other places you'd be considered rude if you didn't at least smile. So it's just interesting how sort of that plays out and kind of how culture is really downstream of history in a lot of ways.
All right, so I kind of understand now the significance this plays in our profession. If we say got a client from Georgia or even New Jersey, would you just go into that conversation with this understanding and kind of maybe approach it differently?
I think knowing that they're from a different area and making at least the initial assumption that if they're coming to me from there, they're calling me from there, something that they've always been there. Which we have clients, for example, who started working us with us when they lived in Georgia, but they were raised in Kansas. So like there's situations like that where you just find out later it's not the case. But if if somebody like schedules an appointment and they're in New Hampshire or Illinois or Washington or something like that, I'm going to sort of be a little bit more careful about my generalizations around things like values. Like, when we talk to our clients here in Colorado, we can generally anticipate some desire to help kids with college. We can generally expect that there might be a little more indifference to helping out family members or parents than otherwise. Not to say people are like unkind, letting people help their parents as they age or something, but it seems like we have a lot of people who are like, I think my parents are kind of on their own. They'll figure it out. And I wouldn't want to sort of jump to those default conclusions as much from somebody who is coming to me from a recognizably different cultural zone, because I don't want to assume things and inadvertently alienate them or make them uncomfortable because suddenly I'm just like pushing my values on them in a way that I don't even realize. I'm not consciously doing it. But when I'm like, oh, and of course you're going to pay for your kids' college, and maybe they're like from a community where that's just not really a thing. So it's just recognizing that a little cultural sensitivity, a little cultural literacy, and some emotional intelligence goes a long way in communicating with people from different cultures.
As much as I'd love to continue hearing about it, my natural curiosity wants to ask you about the rest of the seminars and presentations. What else do you have for me?
Sure. There was a terrific presentation by a planner named Hannah Moore. She has a financial planning practice down in Richardson, Texas, which is a northern suburb of the Dallas area. But she runs a practice called Amplified Planning, which I think outside of like an Edward Jones or Northwestern Mutual that have like hired and turned over probably like 100,000 people at this point, in the present, as far as like one person training a number of financial planners. I think Hannah Moore at this point has trained something like 4 or 5 thousand financial planners through a program that she puts on called the. It was originally the FPA externship, and then it split off from the FPA and just became a thing that she was doing. But this educational program really built around providing a hands-on learning activity that was originally during COVID supposed to replace like actual internships for students who were going to have an internship but then lost it because of the pandemic, and since has become essentially the largest initial entry training platform for both students, career changers, anything like that. So that's just the context for who Hannah is. But she did a really interesting presentation on how we're attracting and retaining financial planning talent in the field, because she has a lot of primary data from all the people who are coming through her program, because she has students, she has career changers, she has people who are already working at planning firms, but maybe not getting a lot of training or formal direction. And so, the standouts there were things like, more people coming into the planning field, whether they're career changers or students, care about things like the culture of the firm and getting coaching and mentorship and education as a primary benefit. Then they care about things like flex time off or unlimited vacation or cell phone reimbursements or something like that.
That's really cool. I think the financial planning industry needs more great planners to bestow their knowledge upon the future generations, and it is something we talk about a lot as well. What, when you say training and 4 to 5 thousand advisors have made it through her program or training, what is training? What does that look like?
So the externship, at least as I've seen it and understood it, and I actually once guest lectured for it in the very first year of it when it was attached to FBA. But essentially, it's this sequential learning where, like, every week they're focusing on a different planning domains. Like, this is investments week, this is retirement planning week, this is tax planning week, this is estate planning week. They have multiple planners come in and I think now record as opposed to doing it live, but they invite multiple planners to come in and explain how they do it in each topic. So, like, here's how Dan Yerger does retirement planning. Here's how Daniel Stefanski does retirement planning. Here's how Emily Green does retirement planning. And, assuming that we're all from different firms, like, what is your approach? What is your style? How many meetings does it take? How do you approach these different problems? So giving the students a lot of exposure to just like, hey, planning is not one thing. There's not one magical way to do it. It's different. Every firm approaches it. Every planner approaches it in different ways. And then the other end of it is they get hands-on practice with tools like eMoney and other financial planning software and so on. And then they also get recordings with real clients. So Hannah's practice today is essentially sort of a lab laboratory. Like, she has planning clients and manages money and does these things, but like all of her clients sign essentially, or like when they onboard as clients, sign a thing saying like, we are okay with being recorded and having our information used as part of educating financial planners. And so she then takes something like a recording from a new potential client who signs that waiver. And, it might be like a 20 or 30-minute initial consult, but it might turn into like an hour and a half video, because she'll go back to this video and this recording of her having this planning conversation and pause as the clients or as she says certain things and then narrate and explain. So, when they said, well, I'm not sure about that, that indicates to me that we need to dig a little bit deeper on that topic. And when they said that they have this type of asset, that tells me that they have to have worked with a financial advisor before, because you can only get that sort of product through a financial advisor. So now I need to dig into that and understand their history and working with planners a little bit more. So providing the practitioners, but the students, with lots of perspectives on what financial planning is and the various subjects and how it gets done, providing them with hands-on access to tools so they can really play with it for the first time in many cases, and giving them insight into real client meetings so that it's not this esoteric idea of like, one day I will something with money for people. Like, you can actually see what those conversations look like and get a better understanding of what the professional field is.
Well, that's really cool. I'd love to see what those videos and tutorials and trainings look like. for those that don't know, you teach at CU Boulder, the retirement planning class, and I had the privilege this semester to attend the class. And I think that was one of the standouts from observing the second half of every class was you went into the financial planning software and allowed the students to experiment and see what works and what doesn't work, and then give them a task that they had the opportunity to present at the end of the class, which is the hands-on software training that a lot of these students need, and also how to present it and the way to tell the story in an effective manner. And I think students do need that hands-on application and knowledge. How do you weigh that and the real-time experience with the first half of your class, which is essentially a lecture where it's all really technical knowledge?
I think functionally the easiest answer here is when I teach financial planning, I'm teaching it for two purposes concurrently. I'm in the first half teaching them to pass the CFP exam. So I'm trying to cram knowledge in, contextualize, explain, help them understand how Medicare works, how taxation of retirement accounts works, how conversions and transfers function, what it takes and is required to run a retirement plan for a business. Like I'm really just trying to give them the knowledge. But the distinct definition between financial knowledge and financial literacy is the ability to apply it. So then on the back half of the class, when they are working in financial planning software and building models and testing assumptions, what they're being taught there is to apply that knowledge that they were just lectured on and read about in that prior week, but also then teaching them work skills, right, to build financial plans, be able to say on their resume, hey, like I've built financial plans in eMoney, and if I want to become a financial planner now, I am much better qualified to go into a firm and actually have that experience to make me more competitive in the job market.
Excellent. Well, it seems like the financial planning landscape's a little better off because of you teaching and some of Hannah Moore's tutorials and teaching as well. But that being said, what else do you have for me?
Well, I mean, I'll also just say before we move on here, Hannah's definitely doing a lot more work on this than I am, so much appreciation to her for it. I think the next interesting thing that I went through was a panel presentation by doctors Tim Todd from Liberty University, Michael Kofikota, who teaches at Columbia and is actually taking an appointment over at Oxford, Dr. Stu Hackman out of Texas Tech. So all really big research names in the financial planning space, and they essentially did a summary of all the research that was published in the journal Financial Planning last year, along with sort of color commentary. Like here's what the paper said and what was submitted and what the results were. Here's like more from our expertise as researchers to round that out. So there was a whole bunch of topics there. I think the first interesting one, which actually was two separate papers, so I'm just going to combine it here. But essentially, it was on the use of AI in financial planning, kind of what it can do, what it can't do. And at least the state of the union as far as AI goes for financial planning is that AI right now can't be trusted to do financial planning. Not to say it won't evolve or get better at some point and be more useful, but the problem is that AI hallucinates way too frequently. It also often just makes math mistakes because it's not actually doing math. It is using probability to input what seems like the most probable number to follow in the sequence of numbers that makes up an equation or a calculation. So it's funny because computers are great at math, but AI doesn't actually do math. It's just like sort of ascertaining cyclically that the next number following 8 must be 5, and what must follow that is 0, and the next one must be 0, and then it's so on. But in that particular context, then the challenge is that really at its core, AI doesn't do deep analysis. It's not good at contextualization. So it hallucinates a lot. It's bad at the math, but also even when it makes ostensibly correct recommendations, it's often doing so at a very surface value, and it's not able to evaluate the deeper factors that might take what is otherwise a generally good recommendation and make it a bad recommendation because of the facts and circumstances surrounding a client's needs.
Well, I guess that bodes well for you and me then.
I mean, yeah, some job security, but I think it really is like every other piece of technology that's come along. We thought that accountants and CPAs and whatnot would be done for when personal computers got good enough and cheap enough that everybody could have one in their house, right? Like you think, oh, TurboTax, it's over for all the tax preparers. And decades on, no, it's not, because it turns out tech tools are useful and tools can make your life easier. Tools can make you more efficient. Like it's easier to garden with tools than it is to dig around the soil with your hands. But on the other side of that, it's only as useful as the person with the skills to use it or use them. And in something like using AI to answer financial planning questions, the greater challenge there is that you can't, if you're using one and you're not an expert, you're not going to know if it's right. You would just have to take it at face value. And so those issues with bad math, hallucinating answers are really challenging because AI is never shy about thinking it did a good job. Like AI is always like, oh, happy to help. Here's the most valuable thing you could do related to the question you just asked. And that can instill some pretty dangerous false confidence in somebody who doesn't know whether it's right or wrong in the advice it gives.
All right. So, from a consumer standpoint, you probably stay away. However, take me or you. Can it be a compliment in any way to our work?
Absolutely. And I think we talked about this maybe on a recent podcast, or this was on one of the recent episodes. I think AI is useful in things like note taking right now. It still gets things wrong, but it can at least capture like a transcript and give you sort of summary data very easily. And then I think by extension from that, I would fully expect to see tools developing over time where essentially instead of having to like read through a client's documentation and take data from that to enter into planning software, there will be tools sort of like Halistoplan is today, where it can like read a tax return and just like tell you everything that's in the tax return that matters. I think we'll see more and more tools oriented towards simplifying the data gathering process and the plan generation process, where it can just take transaction data or take an investment account statement and pull all the relevant data into the plan model and save you from having to do it by hand.
Great. And you said this was one of the topics of the panel. There were others as well.
There were a ton. They covered a whole year worth of research. So I got like another 10 topics I can talk about here.
Which one was your favorite besides that?
Which one was my favorite besides that? I'm probably going to say it probably ended. Well, here, actually, I'll call it my favorite and my least favorite. I'm going to lie. I'm going to call it my two favorite and my least favorite. One of my two favorite was for professionals and one was for the public. That's part of why I'm splitting it. So one of the ones that I really loved was called "Why Are There So Few Women in the Financial Services Industry?" And I don't love the question as far as like I don't want that to be the case. But it was just a really interesting paper that sort of explored what work life needs to look like for women in the industry to be happiest and have the best retention, because we already have a high failure rate as far as people staying in the profession or in the industry at large across all demographics, but women are singularly sort of vulnerable to it, and thus they are more underrepresented than they otherwise should be. So there was a really interesting paper on that talked about things like working with clients, being responsible for bringing clients on, having other women to work with instead of just being on their own, or being sort of like the one woman in a firm full of men. So things like that were interesting. My other favorite paper was on retirement portfolios and assessing the value of something like Social Security or a pension in light of portfolio allocation, because what a lot of people do is they mentally account for Social Security or pensions as being completely unrelated to their portfolio, and then they allocate their portfolio as if they didn't have a pension or didn't have Social Security, and this often results in them being overly conservative in retirement and not necessarily taking the best sort of risk-adjusted returns they could, in light of the fact that they have this Social Security serving as this annuity, or they have a pension, or they have an actual annuity. People just don't think of it as a retirement asset, but it's possibly one of the most valuable ones you have.
Oh, those are both pretty good. Starting with the women in the financial services industry, you mentioned client acquisition and working with families is something that keeps them in the career and in the industry. So does that mean things like just building plans and doing analysis don't?
Not at least from any statistically significant results. So there's just not evidence that like being a great financial planner and just grinding out plans in the back office does anything for your retention, your happiness in the field. But working with clients and bringing clients into firms and building your book of business, as it were, are things that are positively impacting. I think a really interesting call out was actually that women with children, particularly young children, are much more likely to stay in the profession, which is a really strange sort of counterfactual to the normal assumption that a lot of women leave the workforce when they have children. But in our field, women with children tend to stay.
Did they provide any thoughts on why that might be?
I think we can sort of rationalize that it might be that the like work life balance is phenomenal, generally speaking. There can be a lot of kind of flexibility afforded, but also that financial planners are just by most studies pretty happy people. You don't hear a lot of people just being like, "Ugh, being a planner, it's so miserable and terrible. I hate my job." Like it's a very uncommon thing to hear. And so I think in that same context, they are a lot of them being financial planners are able to think about, pregnancy, having children, whatever it is, and account for the fact like, oh, I'll take like time off, I'll take some maternity leave and, raise my child for a little bit. But I know what that does to my financial plan. I know what that does to my career and so on if I do that. And so being so aware of the impacts, I'm going to make better career choices as a result. Not to say that that means that they're better life choices. It's not to say that if you work, it's good, and if you don't work, it's bad. But just being mindful that, at least amongst women in the financial planning field, they're just much more likely to stay in the game.
That's really interesting. When I came in this morning, I asked you how the conference was, and I tried not to dive in too deep because I wanted to save a lot of the meat for this conversation. But one of the tidbits that I believe came out of this panel that I thought was interesting that you haven't yet mentioned was the productivity of remote meetings. And you said, I believe, from our perspective as the advisor, they feel like a great use of time. But from the client's perspective, they don't feel like a productive use of time, to paraphrase.
Yeah, pretty much. The particular finding there, bearing in mind we're thinking about like averages from a data set. So of course you can just think that remote meetings are awesome no matter what, and you might think that in-person meetings are awesome no matter what, and or have the opposite feeling about either side of that. And so in that context, for the remote meeting thing, essentially as financial planners, we're like, oh, we just hop on the Zoom call and we see our client and we have a lovely chat and conversation and we get some stuff done. And then, we click boop and the meeting's over and we go immediately to our next task. And like, what an efficient way. And the challenge that it seems is there for a lot of clients is that efficiency is sort of awkward. It doesn't feel very humanistic for the people who are on the receiving side of that relationship. And so there's things like taking a moment to pause, or if for anybody who's watching the YouTube, if you said something interesting and I sat here and went, in person you might look at me and say, oh, like he's thinking about it really hard, but on Zoom you might worry that the screen just froze. And so then suddenly like, these thoughtful contemplative moments are very hard to do in this Zoom medium unless I say something like, let's just pause and think about this for a moment. And like we all just like sat there in silence. But if I didn't preface it that way, a way that I wouldn't have to if we were in person, just sitting across the table or in chairs next to each other, there's just a slightly less human experience to the Zoom medium. Not to say that Zoom is not just a very efficient tool, or tools like it aren't very efficient tools to save travel time and commute time, or to be able to do stuff from home in the comfort and so on. There's definitely some efficiencies there, but at least the gap between how planners think about it and how clients think about it is big enough to be noticeable.
That's an interesting one because we have an office space and we work with a lot of clients in person. However, we also provide a Zoom option, and there's clients we've never met in person. Now, knowing this information, do you think we will just be aware of it or change anything in our virtual meetings as opposed to those in person?
I think, in particularly, the interpersonal part of that is what I'm going to be very mindful of. Like, if a client is asking to have a meeting and I know it's for a sensitive topic, I might be inclined to do something like send a Calendly invite that is only in person instead of a Zoom, if only to nudge them to just schedule that, and maybe they come back and say like, sorry, I don't really have a lot of time to come in office, can I do Zoom? And, oh, of course I'll send you that link too. But trying to sort of perform, I think, what Carl Richards would call a righteous trick, and just trying to nudge people in the direction where I know we can have a more personal conversation and a more human conversation, and maybe better level set tough emotions or help overcome stress in a way that's hard to do when we're just on camera.
Yeah, I completely agree. Coming from a firm that was fully virtual and working there for the better half of 4 years, and then coming here and being able to observe the difference between fully virtual conversations and in person conversations has been a really big eye opener for me. There's a I know my stuff and I can have notes up on a screen for a web conference, but when you're in person, there's a whole new element. There's a person sitting across from you who can see if you're fidgeting or if you're not looking them in the eyes or whatever the case may be. And it requires a an additional skill and an additional level of personable skills that you just don't have to do on Zoom. That being said, I really love working with clients in person. And as convenient as Zoom tends to be, if I had the option to pick one or the other, I'd pick in person every day and twice on Sundays.
Well, there you go. Note to everybody who's listening: Daniel will happily meet with you in person on Sundays.
It could be on the golf course for those that are interested. It does not have to be in an office setting.
It would certainly be more interesting than Zoom to do it on a golf course. Whether you can golf or not, it'll at least be more interesting.
Sure. Well, you said there was one you disliked from this panel as well, I believe.
Yeah, it bugged me because it feels like something that a reviewer should have just called out in a way where it's like this got published. Come on, what happened here? It was this analysis essentially of the pros and cons of buying a term life insurance policy, so something with like a 20-year term, versus buying a permanent policy and then holding it for the same amount of time and then deciding to sell it to a life settlement or viatical company where in selling it you're then gonna get some money back for it and maybe defray the costs of the permanent insurance you had. And it was a really deep dive technical analysis, quantitative sort of thing on the model of like whether that worked or didn't work, and looked at interest rates and opportunity costs and all sorts of things. That part was all fine. The thing that bothered me is that there's a insurance product in the life world called return of premium, where essentially you get a very expensive term policy for, let's say, 20 years, and if you hold it to the end of the term, you get all your money back. Like the insurance company essentially makes their money on just like investing the extra for a little while, and then essentially kind of like your security deposit, as long as nothing goes wrong, they'll just give you your deposit back. So instead of paying let's say $1,000 a year for life insurance, you pay $3,000 a year for life insurance. But to take then the 20-year example, the difference there is in one case you spend $20,000 and you never see that $20,000 again. In the other case, you spend $60,000, but at the end of your time, you get your $60,000 back. And so, considering that they were looking at something like what if you buy term for 20 years versus what if you buy permanent for 20 years, but then you try to recoup some of your costs on the permanent, at that point, it seems strange to me that they didn't analyze the distinction between those first two and a product that literally is designed to refund you at the end.
Yeah, it's a very interesting concept, especially because insurance it's very weird in that regard. Its best benefit is the one you never have to use and you never touch. But it seems like a somewhat sort of a missed opportunity in that regard there.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure it would be ripe for a replication, and then for somebody to just go ahead and do that part of it as well. But it just seems like something where if I was a reviewer for the journal, that would have been my very first question. Like, well, what about a return of premium policy? Why don't we look at that and see if that's sort of in the middle somewhere, or it's better or worse, or who knows? It was just very strange to me that didn't come up.
Could you now do that research, Doctor?
I could. It's not really my interest area, so like yes, but I don't want to. I guess is probably the best way to look at it. I suppose also this means that I have officially found a perfect opportunity to ask a question in the academic parlance, which is, why did you do this wrong and how dare you? So for better or worse, I would like to ask that author, why did you do this wrong and how dare you not do a return of premium term life policy to really check the edges and the opportunities.
Well, am I missing anything? Is there any other conversations or things that came up from the retreat you want to talk about here?
Oh yeah, I mean absolutely. Sorry, we can talk about this all afternoon, Daniel. But we'll keep it a little more succinct. So our other keynote speaker at this conference was Elliot Harris, who's the Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development at the UN, and is also the Chief Economist at the UN. And that was just very interesting because a lot of financial planning conferences will bring in like a markets guy. So they'll bring in somebody from like JP Morgan, and they'll stand up there and they'll talk about like the VIX and volatility and the S&P and the history of this, blah, blah, blah. But this is an economist, like a real, been doing it for 40 years economist. Again, chief economist for the UN. That's not an easy gig to get. And so he's also looking at the sort of the economic conditions now from a global perspective. And the interesting thing that came with that, very succinctly, because it was a hour long talk. He had no slides. He talked straight for an hour. So it was very interesting because he sort of looked at it and said, "Look, what's happening in the United States right now? There is an objective, and you could argue and agree, disagree, whatever, over the objective. Right? You could say that this doesn't make sense to me, or it does. But what we're doing in terms of trade policy, tariffs, all of the stuff that's been going on for the last month or two is not going to obtain the outcome that is desired for the stated goals." So, and he pointed this out in terms that the United States has created the international trade system. Like the way things work today is because we decided it was going to be that way, and we essentially arm twisted and coerced and threatened everybody around the world to do it that way. And in the cases of our friends and neighbors, said like, "Look, this works for us, this worked for you, yes." And so we're doing a bunch of stuff that is, at least by all the available data and research, not only kind of generally harmful right now, but also, again, not going to actually create the outcome. And so that has interesting ramifications in the future, which is, the United States has been the holder of the reserve currency for decades, right? Everything in international trade happens in the dollar, essentially. You have all the ways that, securities work, how capital markets work, how investments from organizations like the IMF function. And all of those sort of exist on a bedrock of American stability. And when we suddenly are undoing our own systems or sabotaging our own mechanisms that we put in place, or in some cases just outright violating treaties that we not only signed on to but proposed in the first place, that calls into question the quality of that bedrock. Because if you can't really trust that we're going to keep our word, and that we're not going to really let markets operate the way they have historically in an economic sense, then that sort of raises a lot of uncertainty about, well, okay, if the U.S. can't be trusted or can't be considered reliable, or we have to worry that every 4 years there might be an enormous shakeup in how they do these things, do we need to find more alternatives to that? And that could cause some pretty big changes. Now, I will say, to his credit in this particular regard, the question got asked, like, has there been irreparable damage so far? And he said, no, not yet. But if we keep doing this, at some point, something is probably going to change permanently. And what that thing is, how small or broad it is in scale, we don't know. But just in the general sense, right now, what we're doing in light of the objectives as we've declared them doesn't make sense. And if we keep doing this, we are going to cause some lasting changes, and maybe not the lasting changes we were looking to accomplish.
That seems like a bright gentleman, especially one of the points you brought up there is trust and reliability, and the fact that, starting to, maybe do some things that in the past we haven't done, and how that makes people skeptical of us to trade with in the future might impact things long term. Did this gentleman have a solve or potential ways out of the current state, or things that he saw maybe happening down the line?
Not so much as solve, and he confessed that part of his challenge, part of the reason he didn't have slides, is because so much has even changed in the last 6 weeks that he couldn't keep anything consistent. Just too much is changing too rapidly. I think if there was a theme to his answer on that question when it came up, it was sort of we just need to slow down, and we need to be more deliberate and make changes that actually align to the objectives as stated, or we need to be more honest about what our objectives are. But right now, we're sort of saying one thing, doing a different thing, and nobody's sure what to do with it. And the longer we keep doing that, the more harmful it is. So it was more of just like a stop doing that, and you can make changes, but just do what you say you're going to do in a consistent manner.
Sure. All right. Well, I'll give you one final opportunity to say something you took away that we haven't discussed yet today.
All right. Well, best for last. My favorite session by far was actually an asset protection session. And that's because like insurance and estate planning at a lot of financial planning conferences are kind of boring, or you kind of avoid them because like if it's an insurance one, is it being done by an insurance company? Are they really just here to are they here to teach me about like the benefits of a life insurance strategy, or are they here to teach me about the benefits of their life insurance with a strategy? So it's something where you often find yourself sort of avoiding or shying away from those topics. But the best subject, and I think the best presentation that was there, really focused on asset protection after all the mechanisms we normally think of as financial planners. So as financial planners, what's your best risk management tool? Insurance right away. Let's just pay somebody to take the risk off our hands. Beautiful, love it, great. What's the best risk tool for estate planning? Well, it's trusts, it's wills, it's powers of attorney, it's putting legal mechanisms in place to make sure that things happen with your assets the way you want them to when you die or become incapacitated and so on. And so we advise on these things all the time, but these are all sort of like preventative prescription type things. And what we often don't get into is what happens when those things are actually in jeopardy. So, like, what happens when your client actually gets sued? What happens when your client is incapacitated? What happens when their spouse is financially, engaging in infidelity and is spending money they're not supposed to, and so on? So, this presentation really got at certain issues that really just boiled down to geography, like what territory, country, or state do you live in? And which states and territories and countries are the most preferable to live in for different things. So, for example, Florida and Texas have an unlimited homestead exemption. Now, they have certain limitations around like how much acreage you can have in urban or rural areas, but like there's no limit on the value. If you have a $50 million mansion in Palm Beach, and it's on half an acre in Florida or less, then congratulations. No one can take that house from you. Doesn't matter how bankrupt you are, how much they sue you, whatever. You can keep this $50 million house indefinitely. That's an incredible mechanism. You have guidance around using tenants by entirety, which essentially creates an indivisible shared ownership. So most of our clients, most people there in Colorado use joint tenants with rights of survivorship. But in that model, technically nothing stops one of you from like selling your half or transferring your half. So tenants by entirety requires that everybody come together and agree that if any change is going to occur, they have to consent to it. So that creates some creditor protection, because let's say I hit somebody with my car and they sue me and I don't have enough insurance and they come after my house. But I'm not in homestead state, but I'm in a TBE state. Well, in those particular cases, the nice thing that happens there is even if they get a judgment against me, they can't take the house because my spouse would have to consent to it, because they cannot be forced to give up their portion of ownership or share of the ownership in some way, shape, or form. So there were those particular factors. There were things like, again, Florida is a good example of states that don't allow garnishment. So sometimes you can say, like, oh, well, I don't have any money, but I do have a job and I do have an income. And so creditors or the government come in and say, well, sure, you don't have any assets, but every time you get a paycheck, you have new assets. So we're just going to step in between you and your payroll company, and we're going to take 20% off the top to pay off your creditors. Some states just say, no, you can't do that, or they cap it. Other things then involved DAPTs, which are asset protection trusts, and these are essentially set up in certain states that permit them, where you can essentially have a trust that's irrevocable, therefore has some protections against creditors and so on, but that you can still retain control of and be a beneficiary of. So even though it's irrevocable and that creates some protections because it's technically no longer yours, you can then still tell it what to do and receive things from it. So it's sort of a revocably irrevocable trust, if that makes any sort of non-logic when I say it. And then we finally got into things like Cook Island trusts, or doing things in the Bahamas, Swiss bank accounts, etc. And really the moral of the story boiled down to this: you can have the best asset protection by living in the place that offers the best asset protection. But when you live in a place like Colorado, which frankly does not have great asset protection laws, and you try to use Florida rules, you try to use South Dakota rules, you try to use Nevada rules or Cook Island rules, typically speaking, the courts and the judges in the place you live will be like, that seems like a pretty deliberate dodge on your part. I don't like that. I'm just going to invalidate that. And so it's the big takeaway from that is there are companies out there, there are these law firms out there that really heavily market to like doctors, to business owners and executives, people with a lot of money, and essentially scare them into paying them, $20, $30, $40, $50,000 to set up these really complex, LLC, trust owns the LLC, LLC is domiciled in a different country, like really complex setups, all for the idea of them like protecting their assets. So if ever anything goes wrong, nobody can take their money from them. And what's going to happen in practice, just based on the parameters of this lecture or this presentation, is almost none of that's going to protect you. Because at the end of the day, if you don't live in the place with the protection, if you're just trying to borrow protection from elsewhere, it's all just going to fall apart. So it was a really interesting presentation, super engaging, super fun. That one was actually done by Kurt Brewer, who we know here in Longmont. So fun small world thing there, but truly talented presenter, really interesting content. I really hope we see him do more stuff like that at other conferences.
Oh, well, representing Longmont well. Thanks, Kurt. It sounds like a really cool presentation, especially in regard to asset management or protection. And as you said, that typically tends to be some sort of insurance or proprietary product pitch. So it's nice to get away from that for a little bit.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, part of the presentation was like, look, get that big umbrella policy, have good homeowners, have all of that. Like, there's no replacement for good insurance. But if that stuff fails you, this is really where the line is going to get drawn in the sand about when somebody can stop reaching into your pocket.
Well, even in the 45 minutes or so we spent here, I've learned a ton. Do you think, or what do you think about the retreat for next year? And do you think you'll go?
I mean, I'll absolutely go. In part because I would go anyway, just to be clear. But I am actually going to be chair for the retreat next year. So not only would I go, I have to go. So with that in mind, I certainly will. It remains one of the best, if not the best, conference in the financial planning world, hands down. So from that standpoint alone, they could literally strip out all the amenities. They could take away all the educational contents and sessions. Just the quality of the conversations you get to have with your peers alone is worth the price of admission.
Excellent. Well, I hope to earn the right to go one of these days.
Someday soon. Well, I suppose on that note, then, now that you've picked my brain about retreat, I get to ask, what have you learned in my absence, Daniel? What new experiences or bits of knowledge have you picked up such that you are ready and able to go forth and conquer the world a little bit better informed?
I thought I almost escaped for a second there. But I was thinking of something that actually I can kind of relate to your experiences going to conferences. Is last Friday I had coffee with a CFP in Denver named Devin. And I think it's really valuable, and something I'm starting to learn is the value of expanding your professional network with folks that are a lot like you. So I'll be attending the FPA Next Gen conference here in Orlando this year. And whether it's through a formal conference, coffee, beers on the weekend, or whatever the case may be, I think it's important to expand on that network, whether you're a CFP or whatever industry it is you work on. You get to bounce ideas off of each other, kind of learn about different ways people do the same work. Kind of like you mentioned how Hannah Moore brings in, various professionals to see how they do the same thing, really. Even recognize areas of deficiencies in the way you currently operate. And then maybe also, oh, wow, I'm way better at this than I might have realized just because I do it every day and somebody else doesn't. And then understand, as a professional, kind of where you fit into the career, and hopefully even make a lovely referral partner if one day you find that they do work for a client that maybe you don't specialize in nearly as much. And then lastly, I guess, just make a friend in the process.
Well, there you go. And I will say colleagues are like, it's fun to be your coworker. You're a great employee. It's lovely to have you here, but one of the best things about being in a profession like financial planning is that it is such a new frontier in so many ways. And it's a great joy, not only to just get to do it, but also to learn and hear about how others do it and how they make a great impact on their clients' lives. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.